Greetings and a warm welcome from Asian Confluence. In this episode, we are honored to have with us a truly visionary artist, experimental philosopher, and a writer whose work challenges the boundary between art, science, and philosophy. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Jonathon Keats. Mr. Keats, a very warm welcome from Asian Confluence.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be on the program.
Mr. Keats is a renowned philosophical artist with many accolades to his name. His innovative and thought provoking projects explore complex themes such as time, perception, the natural world, climate change, and the environment. His work often invites us to reconsider our understanding of the environment and our place within it, encouraging us to think deeply about the future of our planet. Today, Mr. Keats will be discussing the concept of river time, one of his many projects he is undertaking. I'll just give a small introduction to river time, and then I'll ask Mr. Keats to give a detailed introduction to it. River time is an initiative designed to enhance the public appreciation of river system. In this project, Mr. Keats enlists river as timekeeper, creating a profound link between the natural flow of water and the passage of time. And through this initiative, he not only highlights the vital role the river plays in our ecosystem, but also position them as critical indicators of climate change, urging us to rethink how we measure and experience time in the context of environmental stewardship. Mr. Keats, again, a very warm welcome.
Thank you.
Mr. Keats, starting our conversation, may I kindly ask you to just give a brief about the concept of river time, what it is all about, and how does it work?
Well, for a while, I've been trying to figure out how we got ourselves into this mess. And by this mess, I mean the Anthropocene. I mean climate change, mass extinction, all the different ways in which we're wreaking havoc on planet Earth. And of course, this is a complicated problem, a difficult question, and there are myriad answers that can be given. But one that has particularly preoccupied me is that it may be down to time. That is to say, that the way in which we use time, the way in which we perceive time, the way in which we understand time may be driving us to create conditions that are destructive to ourselves and all other life and to the planet as a whole. And what I mean by that is that if you think about it, we essentially have developed systems by which to reckon time that are isolated from the planet itself and from all life living on Earth. Clocks from the very beginning, over a period of thousands of years, and certainly over the period of several hundred years, they've been designed to work in a way that is absolutely precise. That is to say, second by second, to be completely internally consistent, and also to be isolated from the external world. In other words, not to have any interference from temperature or various other variables in the environment. This has been one of the great technological advancements. It really is remarkable to see the development of the pendulum and all the different ways in which temperature compensation has been worked out. But the consequence is that this gives us a perspective on the planet that leaves out all the consequences of our actions when we start to use the clock as a way in which to regulate our activities, to regulate our actions on Earth. So you might think about it most simply in terms of logistics, the way in which we use clocks to coordinate our actions, where essentially what this does is it allows us to coordinate in ways that we can watch the clock and we don't need to pay attention to anything else. So as a result, we end up with these systems that we create, these ways in which we work that can be highly destructive to the planetary system, ranging from the very local to to the global, and we don't necessarily notice it because the only thing that is regulating us, the only thing that is determining what we do, is the clock, which we have managed to isolate perfectly and completely from all interference from everything else. So, what I've been thinking about and working on for the past 10 or 15 years now has been a different approach to timekeeping that doesn't take precision to be identical with accuracy, and in fact disputes that there is any correlation whatsoever that is inherently to be taken as the basis for how we reckon time. In other words, that we should not be looking to isolate the clock from the environment, but rather we should be looking to situate the clock in the environment in a way that makes it as sensitive as possible to environmental conditions so that the change that we make on planet Earth through our actions, that there's a feedback that we are able to observe that, and that it leads us to be responsive to the effects of what we do. And that really is what timekeeping was before we developed these mechanisms, before we developed the clepsydra, the water clock, which is the very first instance of a clock that was meant to be isolated from planetary conditions, this being thousands of years ago, all the way through the mechanical and the digital and ultimately the atomic clock. Before all that, and for a long time concurrent with it, we would look to the environment to tell us what time it is. In other words, day and night, really obviously. Also the seasons. And this would indicate to us what we should be doing rather than that we should be planting right now, for instance, or we should be harvesting right now because there is an order in on Amazon and it requires that we do the harvest right now in order to be able to fulfill that order. That instead it would be based on all the conditions of the crop and all the climate conditions that are relevant to the crop and when the crop is ready to be harvested. So that being a very simple example in the case of humans, this is, I think, indicative of a much broader way in which time works within our world or has worked within our world before we started to interfere with it. That is to say that all the incredibly intricate coordination that exists, for instance, in terms of bird migration and how the migration of birds is perfectly coordinated with when plants come into bloom and when the caterpillars that feed on those plants, for instance, when they start to feed, that this is all a system in which there are different creatures, different beings all responding to each other. And this falls into rhythms, and these rhythms are variable because of all the abiotic conditions, because of the fact that planetary conditions are not stable, weather conditions are not predictable. It's stochastic, and yet there are patterns as well. So all of this, and I know that I've gone rather far from talking about rivers and river time as such, but all this was informing what I've been working on, which is to figure out how we can take the vernacular of time and how we can apply it to timekeeping such that we are able to observe a clock that is responsive to the environment and that we can respond to in terms of what we do. And that can take many different forms, of course. The environment is complex, and there are many different ways in which we can take its measure. But one way in which I've been especially working toward in terms of the River Time project is, as the project would indicate, I've been looking at rivers, looking more broadly at the watershed, and looking at the watershed as indicative of all the myriad climate conditions that all coalesce around rivers, all the cycles that are a part of the rate at which a river flows. So basically, the idea is to take the flow of time and to calibrate it based on the flow of a river. So, in other words, if you think about the flow of a river in terms of its history, you can determine a flow rate that's an average over the course of years, over the course of seasons, you find that the rate is a number that
3.3.
that is one that may or may not be the same as what you measure right now. And so what I've been working toward is a clock that takes a comparison between the two. In other words, the ratio. So we have the measure of time for that river. And for instance, I've been working with the Chattahoochee River, which is a river that runs through Atlanta, Georgia. I'm also working on the Danube in Vienna and hoping also to bring this to India. Each river has a history to it, but also in the present has conditions that are changing, both in terms of becoming more erratic because the climate, through climate change, is becoming more extreme. And also in the case of glacial rivers, that there is, generally speaking, a speeding up of the river as the glacier melts more rapidly. And finally, when the glacier gets to be smaller and smaller, eventually the glacier is so small that there's a tapering off, and the river may stop flowing ultimately. In fact, it will if it's a glacial river and the glacier is not there. So, in effect, by taking that ratio, it's a way of bringing all those factors into our lives, all those factors that we're affecting through everything that we do. So, this is literally a clock that I'm creating in the sense that it is digital initially. It's a projection that we've had on, for instance, the Anchorage Museum in Alaska, which is where I started the project. It also will ultimately be a hydromechanical clock, a municipal clock, a clock that people will be able to see and they'll be able to experience together when they are in the city together. But ideally, will draw them from the city to the source, to the water that's providing them with their sustenance. And on that river, there will be another dimension to the project, which is the calendar. So the clock is basically taking the measure of the river as a digital signal that is based on the standard ways in which scientists measure flow rate. There are a number of systems that are in use, and we can tap into the data source and use that as a basis for then making a clock run more quickly or more slowly from time to time on the basis of that ratio. But the calendar is ambient. It's situated in the environment. The calendar is a stone, or actually a set of stones, of 20 stones, for example, each one of which has a future date that's cut into the rock. They're limestone, so they'll erode with time. And by calibrating the depth of incision for a date, and by having dates farther in the future cut deeper into the stone, it becomes possible to have a calendar that if all things in the future were to be as they have been in the past, the calendar would coincide with the Gregorian calendar. But as the river changes in terms of not only its flow rate, but in the case of this erosion, also in terms of sedimentation, potentially because of agriculture, also in terms of chemistry, the acidity of the water. Again, agriculture will be a factor. There are many other factors that affect the acidity. All of this become factors in terms of reckoning time. And this becomes a way in which to really experience time on and in the river, and to get into the river and to have that sort of direct experience. So the project takes on all these different forms. And the idea is to have it on many rivers in many places all around the world that become a network, so that we're able to get this sort of global view of the effect that we're having on the planet. And that can potentially be feedback that can inform our actions, but also it remains highly localized so that we're able in our own place to really understand it. And it's not only rivers, but also trees. So I'm working right now with the Long Now Foundation and the Nevada Museum of Art on bristlecone pine trees as timekeepers. These are trees that live for as long as 5,000 years. And if you imagine a sapling and you place markers around it, and those markers are set based on the average growth through that tree, then standing back and giving the tree authority to let you know what time it is, it becomes once again a way in which time becomes variable based on the lived experience of this living being, of this tree. Or conversely, we could say that the cesium atom, in terms of the atomic clock and what the atomic clock is telling us, that actually is what is erratic, what is unstable, or what is destabilized. It's a matter of how we where we place our focus. And I'm asking that through these interventions, these activations, that we place this focus that we have through time on the planet and planetary conditions that we affect, so that we are better integrated, so that we recognize that we are a part of nature, and we are therefore, through this technology that has divorced us, that is separated from us from nature, that it brings us back around.
So the whole concept is to bring us closer to the nature, so we are not being isolated from the nature, but to make us closer to the river time, the way and the time the nature flows, integrate it. So I think the entire project focuses on changing perspective of the public, of the people, and of the policymakers on a certain level. So have you experienced like what is your reaction you have received when people go and check out this river time? What kind of response you get? Do people like this concept, or they are like alienated to it? What's their response?
So the only clock thus far that we have had operating in public was in Alaska, and it was a projection on the Anchorage Museum. And it was really interesting how people responded initially looking at a clock that has the wrong hour, and even more obviously the wrong date, the wrong month, ultimately the wrong year, because there's not only the clock, but there's a calendar that is associated with it, a perpetual calendar. And when people see it, they say that clock is wrong. And then they say, oh, well, river time, what might that be? And then they start to think about the river as a source for timekeeping, as a source for informing everything in our world, because, of course, rivers and water are so central to our being. We're dependent on water, as all carbon-based life forms are here on Earth. And rivers have been the site where the majority of cities and towns before them, where they were situated. Water is essential, and the flow of water is really kind of the crucial way in which we are able to, on planet Earth, how we circulate the essence of our being, how that circulates as a result of all the various weather and climate conditions that we're utterly and completely dependent on. So as people come around to that, what I found is that they they take it seriously, and they start to recognize that it isn't so strange after all. Because the initial response is that the clock is broken, as I said. And then I think that the response is, well, yes, but that's not really how time is kept. That's not really what a clock is supposed to do. And then people start thinking about their experiences on the river. Because everyone, most everyone, has experience on a river, whether it's floating down the river in a raft, or just sitting on the side of the river watching the water. And there's something that's really intuitive about that, and about the way in which it sets your internal clock, sets the pace at which you are living your life for the time that you are in contact with, or in dialogue with that river. So that that intuitive sense comes up for people, not everybody, but for many people who I've encountered, and they take that away with them. And as a result, I think that even when they are no longer necessarily watching river time, and even if they're not using it as a basis, as I propose, that they use it as a basis for deciding when to have an appointment or when to get together with friends, even if they're not doing that, there still is some sense of this of time being all around us, and in everything, in everyone. All all of us are timekeepers, not just humans. Also, all other life forms, all other living systems, of which a river is an example. We're all timekeepers. We're all timekeepers, keeping time through our experience and through our observation. And to me, time ultimately needs to be understood as a relationship in terms of how we use time, how we live in time. That's the meaning. The meaning of time is not at the level of abstraction that a physicist would want to model it, but rather about coordination. And that coordination is not just a coordination between me and you. It's not just a coordination in terms of when Amazon is going to show up with my delivery. It's a coordination between all beings and all living systems. And I think that when people get that from their encounter with river time, even if they're not looking at river time on a regular basis, even if they're not looking at rivers on a regular basis, there's still, I hope, and I think to some extent, looking around them, looking at each other, and looking at the trees, looking at the weather, looking at planet Earth as a living system, as Gaia. And all of this is being taken in. And there's a sensitizing to all of this that I would like to believe has the effect of bringing us that much closer to situating ourselves in nature and to observing ourselves from the perspective that we get when we get outside of ourselves and we're able to empathize with others and use that empathy as a way in which to monitor and to calibrate and to modulate what we do, how we act in the
So,
world.
so just as a person who is like it's a little difficult for to understand how the clock works, can you just break it down the mechanism behind it? Does it like you said you have created a place where the time is getting predicted with the calendar and all, but there's I'm pretty sure there must be a back end a set of data which is working. So what is the mechanism which is behind the screen? If you could explain that.
So let me start by explaining conceptually how it
Mhm.
works, and then I'll try to give a little bit of an explanation without getting into technical details that, quite frankly, I don't know myself because I'm not a coder. But
Okay.
without getting too deep into that, so imagine a water wheel. And imagine that that water wheel is scaled to spin at 1 revolution per minute on the basis of the average annual flow for the river. And you set that water wheel into the river and it starts to turn. Imagine that you connect a gear to the water wheel and another gear, and you use a gearing system so that you have created a clock that the water wheel is powering, but not only is it powering it also is calibrating it. So in effect, the clock is going to run more quickly when there's more water or when the river is flowing more rapidly, and it's going to move more slowly when the contrary conditions are the case. So that gives you kind of a mental model for understanding what river time is doing. So we're not using a water wheel, but rather using, in the case of the United States, where I've developed the first of these in Alaska, and then um, in Georgia, we're using U.S. Geological Survey data. So the U.S. Geological Survey has river gauges, has these devices in rivers all around the country that use pressure or use other means by which to calculate a flow rate. And this this is available as public data
Okay.
online, which we then are able to using computer code, we're able to convert that into a time signature. In other words, basically, we're able to take the ratio of historic data to present day data and use that as a basis for the ratio for the clock rate. All this code, by the way, is open source and available to the public. You go to alaskarivertime.org and you just go to the code tab. You'll find the code there. It's on GitHub. And I'm very excited about the idea that people will do things beyond what we've done so far with this. But basically, we're taking that digital signal and then we're using that as a basis for running a clock, which can be in the form of a projection on a building, or it can be, as is the case with Alaska River Time, you can access it online. It's something that is a protocol as well. So ideally, people will also use it for a smartwatch or various other ways in which people might experience it. And in the case of what we're working on the Danube, and there I'm working with BOKU, the University of Natural Resources in Vienna, and this is part of a project that's an EU-funded initiative called Danube for All. We're looking at this in terms of making a hydromechanical clock. In other words, a clock that will take those data and use the data as a basis for for water flowing through a clock, where you'll be able to read the time on the basis of the flow of that water. And this is a project that is still in the very early stages, but in a few months, well, in March of next year, the clock that I mentioned earlier that's calibrated by the growth of the bristlecone pine trees. So they're the calendars that we're installing in the Great Basin of Nevada, but the clock, which will take a core of the tree and use that as a calibration for for calibrating the clock from time to time. That clock will be shortly installed at the Center for Art and Environment, which is at the Nevada Museum of Art, and that will be a large scale clock, a monumental clock that people will be able to encounter, and where the pendulum length can be adjusted, and the adjustment in the center of gravity for the pendulum becomes a basis for adjusting the rate at which the clock is running. So it exists in this case in an electromechanical form. So all of these are ways in which we're approaching it now, and I hope there will be others going forward. I would like to figure out a clepsydra, a water clock as well. And I also really want to leave this open to other people to interpret and to develop other technologies, because it really depends on that level of public engagement that
Yeah.
is a matter of people taking this time protocol and doing things with it, and also people experiencing it in myriad ways. So, for instance, right now I'm working with UAM, with the Metropolitan Autonomous University in Mexico, on the Rio Magdalena, the last free flowing river in Mexico City. And we're starting to develop what would be a local interpretation, working with people who live there. How do we want to interpret time? How do we want to show this? How do we make it feel to people like this is authentic to their culture, to their experience? In each place, I think it's really important to do that, because the culture of time and timekeeping, this is universal, but it also is specific to each place, to each culture. And each culture has its own way of being in the world, its own relationship with the environment. And so many of these, by virtue of globalization, have been obscured or lost. So I think that part of the process of bringing that back, of reactivating it, is to do so in these local partnerships with people who are able to bring those local references out into this system, out into this provocation, this activation. And all of this, I think, has the potential to bring about not only a recognition of nature and of ourselves as a part of nature, but also a recognition that nothing I've said is at all original. Nothing I've said is in any way anything that anybody would have would have thought strange thousands of years ago. Many cultures today still live in ways that are calibrated by the conditions around them. All of this is actually, this is the norm. And what we
Yeah.
do with clocks and calendars today, that's what's strange. So I'm trying to figure out, how do we reset expectations here? I'm trying to be as unoriginal as possible in that process, but I also am trying to invite others into it so that we can find a way back to that core, back to that memory that we all have at some level, that by finding our way back, but not by being nostalgic, not by being Luddite, not by trying to go back in time, but rather trying to find some way using the technology of today, the vernacular of today, in reference to, in dialogue with this history. That's how I think we find our way into resonance with all other life forms and living systems here on planet Earth.
So, Mr. Keats, one question which is like coming to my mind. So you have a clock, one in Alaska, one in another river, one in Vietnam, and some one in the pine tree. So these clocks, are you seeing any some sort of similarity between them, the way they work, or the time, the final output which comes out? Is there a similarity or a huge difference? What's your observation with these clocks, the different clocks, or the concept of it?
So ask me that in 10 years. Those could be 10 fluvial years, or those could be 10 years according to the clock that we typically use today. I don't know. As of now, we have one clock that has been running for the past well, since 2021. And that actually does allow me to give you a partial answer, because that clock is situated in Alaska with 5 different rivers that are each being measured. Each of them has a clock, and then Alaska River time is the average of those 5. So,
Okay.
so if you go to Alaska River time and you go to those individual clocks, you can see how they are diverging. And this is just in one state in the US. So these clocks are extremely sensitive to local conditions, and yet all of them are, at least the last that I checked, all of them are well ahead of time as reckoned by Greenwich, England, for instance. Time as you would find it on the Gregorian calendar. And that's because in every case, we're dealing with at a planetary level, with a phenomenon that that all these rivers have in common, which is global warming. So that global warming effect is something that is a pattern that can be seen in all of them. Yet each one of them is responding in ways that are slightly different because of the complexities of the environment, of each environment being different. Now, as we move to more places with more rivers, it will probably be even more extreme, the differences between these clocks, because of course not every river is fed by a glacier. And even in the case of Alaska, some of those rivers are spring fed. And of course the glaciers and the springs, all of these are related. And ultimately, I think that what we'll find is, as more clocks come into being and are running concurrently, we'll find at a local level quite a bit of overlap in terms of patterns that will be detectable. At a level above that, a level of abstraction, a level of distance or of generality above that, it will become much more erratic or much less evident what pattern there is. And that's both in space and time. So, in other words, going from just Alaska to the entirety of North America. And also in terms of time, going from minute to minute to looking at it over the course of months or of years. But I think that if we go out to the scale of the entire planet over hundreds of years, once again, patterns will become really evident. And I think that the reason why that is that at a very local level, over short time spans, obviously there are variables, but those variables are the systems are relatively tightly coupled, these river systems. At the planetary level over deep time, we're looking at the phenomenon of global warming, of climate change affecting everything. And we're looking at how that is averaging out. But it's at that middle scale that I think it will be particularly hard to see what these clocks have in common. And I think that all of this is really informative, because it shows how connected all of these systems are. And I think that if we look at trees and we look at rivers as timekeepers, we'll find those patterns in local conditions, and also we'll find it when we scale out in space and time to the entire planet. But I think that what this shows is the way in which there is that coupling, and there are these incredibly intricate and intense relationships at that local level between all these life forms and living systems. And also, it will let us see that at that planetary scale over long time spans, that we're all in it together. That planet Earth, as a living system, has this kind of this totality to it. There's a holistic way of looking at the planet. But I think that at that middle level, and at the level of what seems confusing and maybe chaotic, that also can be informative, because I think that it emblemizes how mystifying all of this is to us living in the moment, trying to somehow work across these scales. And maybe it can inform us, and maybe it can give us a little bit of humility and a little bit of appreciation for how we need both the immediacy of our awareness and of our observation, and also the patience and the sense of this large scale, long term effort to all work together and to all work together over many generations. Maybe there's in that confusion of that space in between, there is a recognition of how we can learn from both of these extremes, and there's a way in which it pulls them together and it draws us out in both directions. And that, I think, can help to situate us in the world today in that really essential way of recognizing that everything we do from moment to moment matters deeply, and we need to be fully in the moment. And yet, that what we do in the moment has a profound impact over deep time, and that we need to be aware of the fact that we're all in it together, and that there are these larger scale actions that are taking place as a result of how we're all acting in confluence, and also in terms of how that has an effect on those not yet born, on all of these different time scales at which other life forms live as well. So bringing all that together, that's, I think, if there are two things that I really hope come out of this experience, and I hope that it's an experience where I don't get to say what those two things are, and people come up with many more ways in which they're responding that are much deeper than anything that I've ever thought. But if we can resituate people in nature as a part of nature, that's one. And if we can bring about this recognition of simultaneously needing to be in the moment and to be in deep time, living that paradox. If both of those can be achieved through this project, then I guess I get to retire. But I'm sure that it will be much more challenging than that, and I'm sure there will be many other projects, many more projects to work on in the future.
So, the whole concept of river time and this entire conversation we had, it's really fascinating to listen to, and the idea you have. So, the way you have combined the art, the coding, the GitHub, the environment, the river, everything together to, if I can say, to produce this interesting concept, interesting art. So maybe just one concluding question, if I can just ask. So, this whole exercise of converging or the confluence of everything which we have explored in the last 40 minutes, uh, how will it shape the public policy perspective? Will it affect that? That is like one of the very crucial question I have in mind, because we are talking about climate change, environment, what we are doing to our Mother Earth. So this will change once the public policy changes. The people, the person sitting at the right position will be able to make some changes. So do you think at a larger scale it will be able to make some impact there?
I very much hope so, and I'm very much working on that as part of what I'm doing. Um, so I'm principal philosopher at Earth Law Center, which is an NGO working on ecocentric law and governance. I'm also a fellow at the Berggruen Institute, where I am working on a multi-species constitution. And in both instances, time and timekeeping are themes that I continually am bringing into the conversation and working toward ways in which this can be implemented, or at least we can model it initially and try to find the buy-in needed to be able to have governments act on it, to be able to have society act on it. I think that we need to recognize a couple things. One is that change at the level of governance is largely dependent on change in terms of the perspective of citizens. And that the change in the perspective of citizens that leads people to vote in one way versus another, that leads people to support one policy versus another, is not only about a political argument in the conventional sense. It's not only about trying to trying to work things out in legal terms. It's not only about candidates and about policies. It's also about culture. And it's about how we act as a result of the culture in which we live, the culture that we care about. So that culture, I think, can lead us in terms of our individual actions and our actions as communities to act one way or another. It can also lead us to vote or otherwise to support one policy eventuality or another. So that's one side of it, or one aspect of it. The other is thinking about it in terms of policy more directly and more conventionally, perhaps. What sorts of policies might make the most of the experiment, the thought experiment of asking, what if the flow of time were calibrated by the flow of rivers? And what we're looking at Earth Law Center, one thing that we're looking at is whether this could become an official time standard. And what that would do is really not fully determine it because of the fact that time affects us in so many different ways. But I think that while it is not realistic to assume or to advocate for this becoming the time standard, I think that by making it a time standard and by giving it that sort of legitimacy and by making it a resource that can be used in terms of regulation, that a lot can be achieved in that way. So that when we think about ways in which time comes into play, that we have this as a point of reference. And related to it is within the domain of rights of nature. And I think we need to be thinking much more broadly and deeply than just in terms of rights of nature, in terms of the question of ecocentric law and governance. But rights of nature absolutely are one way in which to approach this, and a way that has been gaining traction quite a lot in recent time. What we're looking at is a right of nature to live at its own pace. And what that means is that we need to look at all the different life forms and living systems in terms of their needs. And we need to look at all the ways in which we are obstructing what those life forms need in order to be able to live in ways that allow them to thrive, that ensure their well-being. So if we think about an agricultural system and we think about the effect that that has in terms of use of artificial fertilizer, we think about the outflow from irrigation, and we think about the lakes and oceans and the algal blooms. We're looking at essentially a way in which time has been accelerated for that algae, and within that living system, that lake, for instance, is living at a pace that is manifestly accelerated and that is not sustainable in the broadest sense of the word for that living system because of the fact that all the ways in which that system achieves and maintains homeostasis, all the ways in which that system has evolved, all the ways in which the food web works, all the ways in which the parts make up the whole, that is evolved over time in ways that are temporally out of sync with time as imposed upon that system through the use of artificial fertilizer, the overuse of it, and through the outflow that leads to it entering into that living system. So a right of nature to live at its own pace would affect that in terms of real world legal action being taken on behalf of that river for the fact that river is not able as a living system to live at its own pace. Or to take an easier or a less complex example, when we think about light pollution and the effect that light pollution has in the sense that at night in many cities it's almost as bright as it is during the day, the effect that that has on much of the life that lives in the city, not only human, but especially birds, especially myriad other animals living in the city alongside us. We recognize that it's deeply disruptive to circadian rhythms. So if we think about a right of nature to live at its own pace, that gives ground in legal terms, in court, to be able to press the case for these other species, on behalf of these other species, that would lead to policies that would control the amount of light that the city could emit in the nighttime. So these are real world ways through policy to affect how the world works. And while they are not directly calibrated by river time, as I've been describing it, they are more broadly affected and more broadly informed by the recognition of time and accuracy in timekeeping as being a measure that is taken in place in terms of what is happening to given to any given life form in relation to others, to being able to determine what that pace is. Because after all, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about river time. When we're talking about river time as a feedback system, as a way in which, through feedback, to bring us into the environment in a way that attains that homeostasis, what we're talking about is the fact that when that river, as a result, for instance, of glacial melt, when it's flowing at a rate that is significantly greater than it has historically, there is variation in the rate from day to night and through the seasons. This is the way in which rivers flow as a result of the spin of the Earth and the rotation of the Earth around the sun. This is all absolutely a part of the system in terms of its dynamics, in terms of its homeostasis. But this acceleration is not. So the river time mechanism, the river time system, is one that reveals to us in real time and that reveals to us through a vernacular that we know well, that reveals to us how the system is not living at its own pace, but living at a pace that we are imposing upon it. And so that right of nature to live at its own pace is deeply related to this. And this shows, I think, more deeply how when we start to allow for this chronodiversity, for all life forms and living systems to live at their own pace, and we reconfigure how we live in a way that allows for that plurality to be a plurality that is not a case of systems that are in dissonance, but rather that are in consonance. That is how we attain that dynamics, that homeostasis that is so essential to Earth as a planetary system. And I think that ecocentric law governance need to reflect that. I think that this timekeeping through rivers and trees and through algal blooms and through all these other systems, through all these other life forms, this is a way to get there. And we can use policy as a platform, but we shouldn't think of it only as a policy proposition, but also as a matter of culture. Because ultimately, policy and governance are a part of our culture, and that culture needs to be a culture that acculturates us or reacculturates us to this to being a part of nature.
So thank you so much for your time and for this wonderful interaction we had. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So thank you all for watching this wonderful interaction we had. For more such videos, do like and follow our channel. Thank you so much.